Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sony FE28-70mm f2 G Master, a high-end standard zoom with a bright and constant f2 aperture. I tested the lens for a month using the new A12 body launched alongside it, and I've got a separate review of that camera if you're interested. Announced in November 2024 and costing around $2,900, it becomes Sony's first G Master zoom with a constant f2 aperture. Like other 28-70 ranges, it skips the wider coverage of a traditional 24-70 in order to offer something different, in this case the brighter f2 aperture. Attempting a 24-70 f2 would be optically much more challenging, resulting in a lens that's too big, too heavy and too expensive. Now Sony's not the first to make this kind of zoom though, with Canon's RF 28-70 f2L arriving 6 years earlier. In fact, it was one of the first 4 lenses to launch the EOS R mirrorless system back in 2018. It was and remains an impressive lens that coincidentally costs roughly the same as Sony's new version, but 6 years of lens evolution has allowed Sony to create a much more manageable proposition. Canon's 28-70 f2L measures 104 by 140mm and weighs in at a substantial 1.43 kilograms, while Sony's 28-70 f2 is noticeably smaller at 93 by 140mm and roughly 2/3 the weight at 918 grams. Now, this still makes it comfortably bigger and heavier than Sony's latest 24-70 2.8 G Master 2, not to mention more expensive and also obviously missing out on the wider 24 coverage, but for a constant f2 aperture that's a stop brighter across the range, it remains an impressive achievement. Now, while any lens weighing the best part of a kilogram can't exactly be described as light, the Sony 28-70 f2 feels a lot lighter than it looks, and having also used the Canon lens, it's way more portable. Certainly if you're using it for portrait work at an event all day long, you're going to really welcome that half a kilo weight saving. Before moving on, if you're looking for a bright aperture zoom, there's also Sigma's recent 28-45 f1.8 DG-DNR to consider, obviously with a shorter reach but costing less than half the amount at around $1,350, and I've got a separate review of that lens if you're interested. Okay, so let's get on. The build quality of the Sony 28-70 f2, as you'd expect for a G Master lens, is excellent, including dust and moisture resistance starting with a rubber grommet at the mount. Moving outwards, the first of 3 rings is dedicated to the aperture with labelled markings from f2 to f22 in 1/3 increments, and there's an A position for body-based control if you prefer. Like all recent Sony lenses, the aperture ring can be clicked or declicked for smooth operation using a switch on the underside of the barrel, while another switch on the side can lock it in the A position. Next comes a generously wide zoom ring with markings for 28, 35, 50 and 70mm. It's got quite a short throw, less than 90 degrees, and zooming from 28 to 70 extends the barrel very slightly by about 15mm. Between the zoom and focusing rings are 2 custom focus hold buttons, along with a switch towards the underside which can adjust the zoom mechanism between smooth and tight. To demonstrate the range and this stiffness control, here's a video that I filmed with the switch set to smooth, where it feels similar to other G Master lenses. Like other mechanical zooms, it can be hard to maintain a constant speed when filming video. Now for the same operation but with a switch set to tight, which increases the friction, in turn making it easier not just to make very fine adjustments, but also achieve more of a constant speed as you zoom. It's a nice extra to have on the lens. And finally, at the end of the barrel is the free spinning, motor assisted manual focusing ring, which feels very smooth to turn. Meanwhile, the lens employs 86mm filters, not insubstantial but comfortably smaller than the 95mm filters of the bigger Canon version, and you also get a petal type lens hood which has a button to lock it and a small window blind to access rotating filters. Now onto focusing, and you're watching a recording that I made with the lens at 28mm f2 on an A12 body where the lens racks from near to far almost instantly. And now at 70mm f2, where the 4 XD linear motors are able to shift those large lens elements quickly, quietly and accurately. It's much faster at focusing than Canon's version, and also supports 120 frames per second bursts on the A9 III. While the lens has very swift focusing for stills, it's possible to enjoy more leisurely focus pulls for video, as seen here at 28mm f2, which look very smooth. And again at 70mm f2, where you're also getting an idea of not only the potential for shallow depth of field, but also the degree of focus breathing, or rather lack of. Let's move on to a mostly human subject at a typical presenting distance, here with the lens at 28mm f2. Now obviously while 28 isn't wide enough for handheld vlogging, it's absolutely fine for presenting to a tripod based camera, while also capturing a decent amount of the surroundings. Also notice the respectable amount of blurring possible at f2. It certainly gives the composition a nice pop here. I should also mention that while a 24mm lens is going to give you wider coverage, it's still not quite wide enough for handheld vlogging. I personally feel that you're looking at something closer to 20mm for that. Zoom the lens to 70mm and you're at more of a traditional head and shoulders focal length, and at f2 you're going to be enjoying a very shallow depth of field effects. I'll be showing you a more formal portrait test in just a moment. Before moving on to resolution though, a quick look at focus breathing, first here at 70mm f16, where I'm manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. Here I'd say the lens is virtually bereft of focus breathing, so a great result here using the optics alone. And now for the same test at 28mm f16, where you'll see the field of view widen a little bit as I focus from far to near. Now it's not bad by any means, and again you can see practical examples of focusing on my earlier face and bottle tests. But the lens does support bodies with focus breathing compensation, so you're now looking at a clip filmed with the A12 setting enabled. I'd say there's a minor wobble near to the infinity side of the scale, but otherwise the compensation setting is successfully reducing the effect of breathing in return for the usual mild crop. Okay, next for my distant detail test, as always with bright and peer angled so that details run into the corners, and I'm starting here at 28mm f2. Now it is more effort to photograph a real life subject consistently across multiple reviews, but I personally think it is more useful to evaluate landscape performance with a distant scene rather than using a chart at close range. Note by default the lens has shading and chromatic aberration compensation set to auto, but distortion compensation is set to off by default. So in all of the images that I'm going to show you, you're going to be seeing these settings in practice. Taking a closer look in the middle of the frame with the aperture wide open at f2 shows a tremendous amount of fine detail when paired with the 50MP A12. Closing the aperture to f2.8 and again to f4 doesn't bring any visible benefits to sharpness, so the lens is performing pretty much at its best here right out of the gate. So returning to the f2 sample and now heading into the far corner shows the details are virtually maintained from the centre with only the very slightest hint of softening. Meanwhile, shading compensation has effectively eliminated any corner darkness due to vignetting, albeit with the usual minor increase in noise as a result. But you do have the choice of disabling the compensation if you prefer and managing it manually. Closing the aperture to f2.8 brings the corner details to a similar sharpness as the centre, and arguably a tad more is possible at f4 if you're really pixel peeping, but this is a lens that's proving very sharp at the wide end. Next for the lens roughly midway through its range at 50mm and again starting wide open at f2. Taking a closer look in the middle again shows very sharp and crisp details with high contrast too, with little to no benefit to stopping down any further in terms of detail. Heading into the corner shows a high degree of detail is maintained when the aperture is wide open, with only a fractional loss of overall sharpness. Stopping down a little can bring that back to match the centre, with the best results around f4 to f5.6. And finally for the lens at the long end of 70mm, again starting with the aperture wide open at f2. Taking a closer look in the middle again shows very crisp details being resolved with high contrast and minimal benefit to stopping down any further. Moving into the far corner reveals some softening in the extremes along with a mild increase in noise, again indicating the effect of shading compensation, but it's still looking pretty respectable. Closing the aperture doesn't make a big difference until you get to around f5.6 and especially to f8 when the corner sharpness becomes close to the centre. So if you're shooting subjects near the middle of the frame, like most portraits, you're going to find the details are very crisp with the aperture wide open, while anyone wanting sharp results across the whole frame, say for a landscape view, will benefit from some closing down, especially as you approach the longer end of the zoom range. But this involves serious pixel peeping, and personally, I'm very satisfied overall by the performance here. Now let's move on to a portrait shot, as this lens will certainly appeal to wedding and event photographers. This was taken at 70mm f2, demonstrating the kind of perspective and depth of field you can enjoy with this lens. As seen on my earlier video examples, there's a really nice separation at f2, and here you can see attractive rendering in the background that's nice and smooth with no distracting busyness. Meanwhile, zooming in reveals the incredible degree of detail that's possible with a high-res Sony body like the A12 coupled with their latest G Master optics. My eyes and beard are very crisp here, and as you'd expect, this combination of camera and lens nailed the focus almost instantly across multiple frames without fuss. Event photographers are gonna love it. For a more formal test of bokeh, here's my ornament test, taken with the lens at 70mm f2 and from the closest focusing distance, which is 38cm across the range. Here you can achieve large and pretty well behaved bokeh blobs with virtually no outlining and only the faintest textures within. For better results than this, you're really going to need a high-end prime lens. Closing the aperture one stop to f2.8 and then to f4 sees the blobs become more consistently rounded across the frame, while the 11-bladed diaphragm system manages to stay pretty much out of the way. At f5.6 and f8 though, the blobs do take on more of a geometric shape, so if you want to avoid this, try to shoot at f4 or larger apertures, which, let's face it, you're going to be likely doing if you invest in an f2 zoom. And for reference, the same test from the same distance, but at the wide end, so you're looking at 28mm f2 here. Again, fairly well behaved bokeh blobs with only the faintest textures and mostly uniform shapes until you reach the extremes. As I gradually close the aperture, you'll again see more consistently circular blobs across the frame, although at this focal length the blobs are small enough to avoid taking on the shape of the diaphragm system, even at small apertures. And at the other end of the aperture range, a couple of examples taken at 28mm f22, showing the potential for diffraction spikes and flare looking directly into the sun. Now, the UK skies can be a little hazy at this time of year, so the spikes aren't going to be as sharp as they could be under other conditions, or say with city lights at night, but it still gives you an idea. And for my final test, a ruler, photographed at 70mm f2 from the closest focusing distance, again of 38cm, where the lens is delivering an image that's 147mm across the frame. From this closest distance at f2, the details have become soft at the edges, but gradually improve as you stop down. And by f8, the edges are beginning to approach the sharpness in the middle. Which now brings me to my final verdict, during which I'll share more images taken with the 2870 f2 on an A12 body. Sony's FE2870 f2 G Master is a high-performance lens that brings something new to the system. Like other 2870 ranges, it trades the wider coverage of a traditional 24-70 for something different, in this case a brighter f2 aperture. This is capable of delivering shallower depth of field effects than an f2.8 zoom, while the extra stop can also of course reduce ISOs or allow faster shutter speeds under the same conditions. As you'd expect, the details are pin sharp in the middle of the frame at f2 across the focal range, while the depth of field and rendering are closer to a prime lens than a zoom. Meanwhile, the corners are pretty well behaved for sharpness wide open, although they will benefit from stopping down a little if you need it. The focusing is very fast and quiet, and virtually bereft of breathing at 70mm. A little breathing is visible at 28mm but can be compensated by recent bodies. As a bright aperture lens, there's also inevitably some darkening in the corners due to vignetting, but this can be effectively compensated by the profile, albeit with the usual increase in noise. Note the profile was off by default for distortion in my tests, proving that the lens is optically well behaved for geometry. Unsurprisingly, it's a fairly hefty lens, although to be fair, it is only 2/3 the weight of Canon's version, and a little smaller too, making it more practical all round. But it is still more substantial than Sony's latest 24-70 2.8 GM2, while lacking the wider coverage of that model. So it ultimately boils down to which range, aperture, weight and price suit you best. The 24-70 2.8 G Master 2 is again smaller, lighter and 3/4 the price, while also capturing a wider field of view, which means you really have to want or need that brighter f2 aperture to justify the extra heft and cost, not to mention the loss of 24mm coverage. Only you know how much you shoot at 24mm and how much you'd miss it, but for me the 28-70 range still proved ideal for general purpose use, and I personally loved the effect the larger aperture could deliver. It genuinely gives more of a prime lens look, but with the flexibility of being able to zoom. As such, I think a lot of wedding and event photographers will be very tempted by this lens, while owners of the Canon version will look enviously at the reduced size and weight. Either way, Sony now offers two superb options for this kind of work, while Sigma's 28-45 1.8 adds another option to consider, and I've got reviews of both that and the Sony 24-70 2.8 GM2 if you'd like to make any comparisons. And that's it for another lens review. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and as always, if you find my videos useful, I'd really appreciate you considering giving it a like and maybe even my channel a follow. It all helps me make more of these videos while minimizing sponsorships. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.